Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our lively discussion session, When the Sky's the Limit in Open Access Models, How Do We Manage Our Workflows? The NISO Open Access Business Processes Working Group. We might have the longest title, I'm not sure. I'm Maureen Walsh, Scholarly Sharing Strategist for the Ohio State University Libraries. I am joined by Amanda Holmes, Senior Licensing Officer for CRKN, Sherry Young, Senior Product Manager, Publishing Products for IEEE, and Chris Shillum, Executive Director of ORCID. Significant portions of the scholarly communications ecosystem are currently transitioning from pay-to-read to open access. The increasing adoption of open access policies and mandates has shifted business practices for associated stakeholders. Yet not all infrastructure, standards, and practices that have taken shape over past decades fit this new world. What's left in the absence of established best practices in the current landscape is a sundry assortment of individualized solutions in libraries and publishers which rely heavily on manual work and legacy workflows, systems, dashboards, invoices, and data. The development of best practices is needed to facilitate and catalyze a variety of established and emerging open access business models. Ideally, best practices would enable the operationalization of financial transactions, deal and policy compliance tracking, and related workflows to be optimized. The NISO Open Access Business Processes Working Group is charged to develop a recommended practice to enable operationalizing open access business processes for authors, libraries, institutions, publishers, and consortia, funding agencies, and other relevant stakeholders. Phase 1 of this work will focus on journals. An initial draft recommended practices document is expected to be available in 2025 for public comment. For our lively discussion today, we have a Google Doc for group notes. We'll also be asking you to participate in a few polls. The polling link is also on the Google Doc. Hopefully the QR codes will work from where you're sitting, but if you need to come up closer, please feel free to do so. I'll give you a minute to get the codes. The polling link is on the Google Doc, so if you just get to the Google Doc, you should be good. If the QR code isn't working to get to the group document, you could go to go.osu.edu/OABP. Whoop. Some people are already done the polls. Okay. All of us on this panel are navigating how best to support researchers and optimize business processes in a rapidly changing open access landscape. On our panel today, we have NISO working group representation from an infrastructure provider, a publisher, a consortium, and a library. We would like to have an idea of the makeup of the audience today. Please fill out the poll with the area that best represents you as a stakeholder in OA workflows. Okay, it looks like we're well represented by libraries and publishers. We have an infrastructure provider, and we have one other. Would the other person like to share their stakeholder area? You don't have to. Scholarly communications? Great, thank you. To frame our discussion today, Amanda, Sherry, and Chris, I would like to ask each of you to briefly highlight what you see as the most challenging aspects of current open access business processes and workflows. And on the flip side, from your perspective, if you are seeing potential solutions evolving. From my library perspective, the bespoke or boutique nature of open access publishing agreements and the inconsistent quality of data exchange that supports them is difficult to wrangle both from a back of the house library perspective, but also difficult for our campus authors to wrap their heads around. Participating on the NISO working group, one area where I commiserate with the other library subgroup members is around the current manual labor-heavy library open access workflows. While established workflows in libraries have had decades or eons to refine workflows, we are still very much in the early days as far as management of OA, and OA administration has become incredibly complex and time-intensive very quickly. Amanda, could you start us off with your consortium perspective on pain points in OA business processes and your thoughts or hopes on how the forthcoming NISO recommendation might help with those challenges?
Okay, so I have some notes I might read, so apologies. I just don't want to ramble, so these will kind of keep me in line, if you will. So for me, one of the biggest challenges in open access business processes and workflows from a consortium perspective is managing the diverse terms and conditions in a variety of open access agreements. So this will be a little bit similar to what Maureen said, but we do come from similar backgrounds. But a lot of these agreements come with a variety of or varying criteria and eligibility terms. And this creates a complex landscape for librarians and authors. And effectively communicating these differences is essential, but often challenging due to the inconsistencies across agreements. For folks who work in licensing, it seems a little bit of a no-brainer. But when folks are not working in licenses every day, it's hard to to keep track of what's what in different licenses. So what I mean here, as an example, is a question that I often get from librarians and authors is whether OA publishing eligibility is tied to submission date or acceptance date. And this is a point of confusion that's driven by a lack of standardization. So this creates an administrative hurdle for authors. If it's not clear on a publisher's website whether they are when they are eligible for OA publishing, then they have to ask their librarian. If the librarian has access to the license, then they are able to find the answer. But if they don't have access, then they are, have to contact the consortium. The consortium has to answer, so this just creates delays for the author and just an administrative burden for everyone involved. So I think what I'm really hoping will come out of this working group and what I think will fix this, and Chris, I do apologize if I'm stealing your thunder here, but is the integration of PIDs, persistent identifiers, in the OA workflow. And I do want to point out that that is a goal that this NISO working group has identified, is how to identify which PIDs to integrate at what time during the workflow, the OA workflow. So I think that this focus on PIDs is encouraging, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how these recommendations can enhance the efficiencies and reduce administrative burden on all parties in the OA workflow.
Which one want me to go? Yeah. Okay. I think I'm up. All right. So coming from the society publisher perspective is a little complementary to what Amanda had just said. So the most challenging aspects from what I see in my role is really creating a workflow and infrastructure that continues to grow to meet the needs of all of our authors and our library customers. So we have authors and part of an institution that could feel very passionately on one item, and then we have on the flip side one that feels passionately on the exact opposite end, and you need a solution from the publisher side that can accommodate all of those different flavors. So this can apply to a workflow solution in the tactical sense, like I mentioned. It can also apply to the terms of many of those agreements that we're working with our librarians on. So something that we can implement to meet our customer requirements is what we're always striving to do. So just as Amanda mentioned, we want faculty and authors to be able to leverage agreements and publish their articles easily. We don't want them to have any barriers to publishing that content. And we don't want them to have to reach out to us constantly or to their librarian or their institution and be confused and say, well, I thought I had an agreement, but now do I have an agreement? And I'm being told to pay this, and I didn't think I had to pay this. And it can be really stressful for those authors. And, confirming those intricate details of the OA agreement, it can be hard sometimes for the librarian. And also for those authors who were really on the front line. So just to note that from IEEE, we have about agreements in about 30 countries. So the flavors of those countries really vary greatly. The needs and the processes that they're looking for range. So with this working group, my goal is that we can come out of this with guidance and recommendations that can span across multiple roles. So can go from the publisher to someone like in Chris's role and to the institutions, while still understanding the collective needs all the way down to the author level.
Fantastic. So hi, everybody. I'm guessing most of you in the room know what ORCID is, but just in case, we are a provider of persistent identifiers, free and open persistent identifiers, and specifically in the case of ORCID, it's for researchers. So we issue unique IDs to researchers. Anybody can come and get one. We have about 9.5 million researchers who are actively using ORCID at any one time. We've issued a lot more IDs than that. And so we're not a party to OA workflows, fortunately. So we don't directly experience the pain. But one of the parts of our mission at ORCID is to really reduce administrative burden across the scholarly workflow. And that's one of the, I think, key roles that infrastructure can provide in solving this problem around OA workflows. But if I step back a little bit and maybe talk about how I think the problem has emerged, clearly there's been enormous innovation around OA business models over the past, I guess, probably 10 years ago, and enormous creativity, and a lot of folks involved in a lot of conversations. And as you might expect, it's a fairly chaotic situation. You know, I think certainly before ORCID, I was with a big publisher for a long time. It was very high stakes discussion. The strategy people get involved, the business folks get involved, the workflow and systems and processes folks didn't get involved very much. And they ended up, at least from my observation on the publisher side, picking up and trying to deal with these deals, these agreements that had been struck with no thought of how we actually going to administer this. And as a result, everything's being done manually, huge amounts of work on the library side, huge amounts of work on the publisher side. The funders who are often interested in compliance with their mandates can't get that data. It's pretty chaotic. And I think that was natural and inevitable. I think one of the other things that's happened on the publisher side is that it's OA forces systems that don't talk to each other or haven't traditionally talked to each other because they didn't need to talk to each other. So in the traditional subscription world, the order processing side, the fulfillment side, and the content publishing side were completely divorced from each other, apart from when it came to access management, like figuring out who got what. So you needed to know who the user was of the content, but you didn't really need to know from a business process point of view who the author was or who the institution was that the author's affiliated with. And that's changed. And at least where I worked, those systems were not set up to talk to each other. So I think what we're trying to do with the OA Business Processes Working Group is not curtail that creativity, but maybe bring a little bit of standardization, because often what happens is there are things that have been defined differently, sometimes because they're important and materially differently, other times because different conversations happen between different groups at different times. They came up with different ideas. They could have converged, but there was no mechanism to allow them to converge on common definitions. That's one of the things we're working on as the group, is kind of a glossary of common terms. So at least we can hopefully use the same language when we're talking about the same thing. And then, I think there's a role for the infrastructure providers in helping the workflows to actually be much more efficient. So Amanda, you already talked about the role of PIDs. Also co-chairing the working group with Amanda is Ivona Kampfens, who is the executive director of another infrastructure initiative, nonprofit called OA Switchboard. Hopefully some of you in the room have heard of that. And what they're aiming to do is act as a a mechanism, an exchange, if you like, for OA messages, right? So if a publisher wants to ask the library who will pay will you pay for a given article processing charge, for example, you can send all those messages to the APC, to the OA switchboard. OA switchboard will figure out how to get those messages to the right libraries. So that's a great example of what infrastructure is quite good at, which is taking many, many problems, which are complex to administer, and putting kind of a central point in the middle that can handle all that routing. But for those things to work well, they need good data definitions. OA Switchboard, along with a number of other groups, have done a lot of work there. I think a broader discussion in the NISO framework, where we bring all stakeholders together, will really hopefully help. And with that, let me stop talking and over to you, Maureen.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you. To open up our lively discussion, we have two more polls. The first is a poll to compile a list of your biggest pain points. So what are your biggest 1 or 2 pain points for OA business processes and workflows?
And maybe I'll just add, if you're not able to access the poll and you feel comfortable sharing your pain points, we do have a mic runner, so you can feel free to raise your hand.
So, okay, we're starting to see some pain points. Great. I'm going to give you all a minute or two. I know you have to have pain points. I see a bunch of you out there. That means there's a bunch of pain points, right? Okay, so far we're seeing funding, money, APC payment, back office workflows and technical services, tracking requests across vendors, communicating agreements to campus, to maintain good quality outcome OA needs an APC that sustains all the quality checks, lack of interest from authors, getting good, clean data from our editorial offices, management of requests, clarity about copyrights, types of open access. We use OABLE even here, but even here, looking at the collective pain points, I do see kind of a convergence around what is missing or lacking. And maybe, coming out of the working group, looking at standards and metadata and reporting, timeliness of reporting and data exchange may help with some of your pain points, hopefully. We're going to move on to the next poll. So for our last poll, we'd like to know if you've been seeing improvement in OA workflows over the past few years, or have they become increasingly difficult to manage? So far we're seeing that they're getting more difficult, or they've remained about the same. 0 so far for they're improving.
Here we go.
Oop, we have an improvement. Percentage-wise, probably not a lot of improvement based on that pie, but. Okay, so they've remained about the same, is the clear winner here, but also some are feeling they're getting more difficult, and one processes are improving. Would anyone like to share, if you're the one who said OA business processes are improving, would you like to share what you see as an improvement and where? We have a microphone if you'd like to share. Just raise your hand. You don't have to.
I would, if I voted, I would have said that they remained about the same. But to respond to your question, Maureen, I guess to be a little bit positive, one of the areas where I have seen improvement is more automation happening. So that's an improvement that alleviates a lot of manual work, especially from a consortium perspective. When CRKN negotiates agreements on behalf of its members, We want to alleviate the administrative burden on our members. So if there is any kind of manual work that needs to be done, CRKN will absorb that on behalf of its members. So, that doesn't solve the problem. It shifts it really to another party, myself or my coworker. So for an example, there is an agreement that we have to manually approve every article that comes in, and it's one of the big five. So there are a lot of articles that are coming in from over 65 institutions. So twice a week, myself and my coworker, we go in and we manually approve, validate all these articles that come in. So that's just one example. That would be great if that one would become automatic approval. But we have seen other publishers are providing that automatic approval. For some reason, this one publisher is not. But that is an improvement. It's slow. We recognize that there are different factors that go into providing automatic approval. Not every publisher has the technical capabilities to do that, or they have different eligibility requirements for approval. There are some complicating factors there, but there are some small improvements happening.
Thank you, Amanda. And as a lively discussion, we would like to hear from you, and we would like to open up the discussion to everyone in the room now. If you said that OA business processes are getting more difficult, or if you agree with that, would you like to share how you're seeing it become more difficult, and maybe in what areas it has become more difficult? Or for those who have said they've remained about the same, are you happy about that? Are you happy they haven't changed? Or do you really feel like something really needs to budge here and we really need to move forward in some way or another? If you'd like to join in the conversation, please just raise your hand and we have a mic that we can walk around.
Hi, thanks. I'm Anna from Taylor and Francis, and full disclosure, I'm also on the working group. I actually said it's getting more difficult from a publisher perspective. So we've done an awful lot in that automation space and to clean up data and practices. So things are improving, but the demands are also increasing faster than many of us in all roles can keep up with those demands. So, the more different business models that emerge for OA, the more, the more demands like in changes in eligibility. Should all authors be eligible rather than just corresponding authors? Do we, how selective certain agreements are, and being, add just more and more layers of eligibility. It makes it more complex for sure. Every time we improve, there's a little bit further to go. Which is, really the great part about the working group is that we are addressing lots of those things that are emerging.
Would you say that those increasing degrees of variability, are they being driven internally from you as a publisher, or from your customers, or a combination of both?
I say the demand is from customers, both. The transformative agreement partners we have, other partners who don't necessarily have a transformative agreement, but are looking, increasingly looking at corporate agreements too. So the demands are coming from trying to look at how we can serve open access to all markets, but also being faced with the challenges of systems that were designed for a subscription model workflow.
Me?
Yes.
So I'm Kinneret from University of Miami, Director of Technical Services, and I'm the one who approves in the system. And I selected that it stays about the same, but I think what's difficult is over time, when we're dealing with this, we encounter so many issues that we haven't thought about them in the beginning, and there are no solutions for that. Like corresponding authors, for example, and it's related to the submission and acceptance. And sometimes we don't have that data in us. Another thing you mentioned about automatic approval. Obviously, it's really easy to select automatic approval, but what does it mean for us 3 years from now? Are we going to be pay more because those order approvals that maybe we missed a few and they're not ours? So we need to find solution for all those kind of things. So maybe the system stays the same, but we need more than what currently is being offered.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that point about the corresponding author is a great example of some of the maybe unanticipated consequences, right? Because I think it's fairly normal for eligibility to be defined in terms of corresponding author. But that's not what a corresponding author was originally meant to be, right? It was meant to be the person that the publisher dealt with to get the article published. And I'm sure, I've certainly heard examples, I'm sure you all have now, of, authors trying to find a, co-author who is at an organization that's funded. But then now we have this idea of multiple corresponding authors for the article, or the submitting author being different to the corresponding author. These are all kind of emergent, but I think unintended consequences of the way that deals are structured. And certainly I think that's a key one we want to maybe try and give some guidance on, to provide some semantic separation between whatever we end up calling it, right? The authors that should be considered for eligibility versus the person whose email address you're going to get to have the forms completed, right? Because it makes no sense the way this thing's emerged.
And to your point about if you move to automatic approval, what does that mean for your renewal or your next agreement? Because it may be increasing your usage of the agreement for with people who are not eligible. So I think, at Ohio State, we've opted to do manual checks of author eligibility for our new agreements. So we have a good understanding, at least at this point, of the error rates that we're seeing in terms of eligibility. We get a better sense of what, the author workflow, the publisher workflow, because we're in it. We have a good sense, especially with capped agreements, of the uptake, the usage. But it's not our intention to stay manual and to stay at that level of intimacy with the agreements. But at this point, we're finding that data very valuable. What is the error rate, and is it different depending on different workflows? So across the publishers, we have 13 read and publisher per pure publisher agreements. What are the error rates per publisher, and what parts of the workflow might be affecting that? So that when we go to renew or add new agreements, we have a clearer understanding of what those error rates might be and what might be driving that. Because, that is a concern. The more you use it, the more the next time that's going to be affected, right? I put up the go.osu.edu/OABP link again, that for the Google Doc. We'd love it if you added your pain points to the Google Doc, and you don't have to limit it to 1 or 2. You can put as many as you want. Also, if you have solutions or innovative things you're doing at your institutions or at your publishing house, or if you're an infrastructure provider, if you'd like to add those too, please feel free to add it to the Google Doc. The working group will be looking at the Google Doc later. So do you all have ways of looking at maybe low-hanging fruit in your part of the workflow that you think that we could collectively tackle? Or are you seeing opportunities to standardize? Like, we have pain points, but if you thought, well, if we all got together and we did X, we think we could solve Y. Is there anything like that that's percolating in your mind that you would like to share?
Yeah, one thing I was going to add that we didn't touch on yet much today, but we talk about in the working group quite a lot, is reporting. So really looking to standardize the reporting. If an institution has an agreement with 10 publishers, but maybe some of them are on their own system, some of them are on a vendor system, and they're getting reports out of multiple sources, those institutions really need consistent reporting out of all of those publisher agreements so that they can go back and look, like Maureen mentioned, analyzing their report and their agreement and seeing, is there something we could perhaps do auto approval, or is there something we can make to find an efficiency? So reporting is something that we're talking about quite a lot. And perhaps it could be a pain point and an improvement right now, depending on where you sit and maybe even on the day.
And I think just to add on to the comments around auto approval versus manual, it's not that if we move to auto that we couldn't also have system checks, right? You sample, you say, okay, are we seeing an error rate? What's happening? So it's not necessarily that you have to have manual approval to know that data, but it certainly helps for us in a new agreement that we're close enough to it that we can help our authors because we're understanding what's happening, especially when we're iterating with publishers new workflows. And with some of our agreements, we've iterated dashboards and workflows in partnership with publishers to improve that process and completely, basically, publishers revamping their author workflows based on feedback. So that level of partnership has been really beneficial for our agreements and for our institution. But as we learn, our hope is that we standardize more, and that isn't as needed. But certainly, we would want to continue to have checks on the system. But that then comes back to having reliable reporting. Reporting is all over the place. With some publishers, it's real time, and with other publishers, it could be a few months later in a spreadsheet. So it's you have a dashboard that's real time, you have a spreadsheet in a few months, or you have a mix of the two. So can we get to a place where we agree on what should be reported, how it should be reported, not necessarily everyone using the same system, and then the timeliness of the reporting. So with things that you're thinking about, you all in the polling had a lot of pain points to share. What would a successful NISO recommended practice look like to you? What would you hope came out of the working group's recommended practice? Or maybe put another way, what pieces or elements should not be forgotten in the development of a NISO recommended practice to ensure a successful outcome? And go ahead.
So one thing I think will be very helpful to standardize and relates to corresponding author, but also other parts of the language in the terms of the agreement, is eligible users. So have one definition what it means, even if it's still we have the same, but at least I know we have one agreement that corresponding author can be also alumni that maybe finished 20 years ago. And in other agreement, it's more limited. So what is our liability if it's not a corresponding offer and we approve it? So I think language, this is one example, but there are other aspects in the agreement that can be standardized.
Thank you.
Just to quickly respond to that, I think, Chris, you had mentioned this earlier. So one of the outputs of this group will be a glossary of terms. So we won't. One of the things this group won't do, and folks correct me if I'm wrong, is we won't really be forcing anyone to say you need to use this definition of eligibility, but this is one that this group all agrees on largely. So that way we are all working from standardized language or common language, and it's something that we can all point to and all have a common understanding of. But what you and a publisher or vendor decide to put in your own license agreements, that we can't force someone's hand there, but at least having common language will be very important.
I noticed a couple of people on the pain points list shared funding or money. don't think we can fix that, unfortunately. But I do think there's maybe a couple of ways at least we can incrementally help. And the first is saving a little bit of money through admin, right? Because I think there is enormous amounts of money being spent both in kind of manual overhead and labor to process these transactions individually, and also in systems development to try and support all of them. But I also think maybe to your point about reporting, that actually getting insights on the outcomes of these OA deals, whether they're helping or not, whether indeed the visibility of the research is being increased, will help justify funding for these kinds of arrangements. So I think hopefully there's some indirect benefit there. But I would love to hear, we're about, halfway through our work, I think, roughly. So this is a good time to, if you want to put anything in our agenda other than the magic money tree, which we can't fix, but from an infrastructure definitions point, we really definitely clearly heard about legibility and trying to at least have some more standardized options. What else would people what's the annoying thing from a metadata point of view or an inconsistency point of view that you would like to see us work on? Because now is still a good moment to make sure that we include that in the work plan.
Maybe just to follow up on Chris's question, we encourage you to be bold and to think a little bit. Like, there are no crazy ideas here. Like, anything can kind of spark some kind of innovation. So anything you think would make your lives easier, now is the time, so we can hopefully incorporate it into the recommended practice.
Hi, I'm Bobby Patham from Springer Nature. I'm also part of the NISO KBOT committee. And there was a question about what other metadata can be supported for the OEA. Since I'm part of the committee, there's a KBOT phase 3 that's going to come up. I wouldn't say soon. We're expecting first quarter next year. So that's going to support the multimedia publications as well as the open access journals like we do. Currently, we have 25 columns, right? Free and paid. 25th column is the access type. And so we'll be adding a new type that's called mixed M. So that's supporting the OEA, the KBOT phase 3 committee. So if you have further questions, you can reach one of us in on the KBOT committee. If you search on Google KBOT phase 3, we also leave some for the public comment. So any recommendations from the librarians, please feel free to.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you. And I think we definitely don't want to reinvent vocabularies when they already exist or when they're in use. So again, if you have kind of favorite vocabularies for any of the kind of elements that are needed in OA workflows, then please let us know. It's always better to converge rather than diverge in these things.
But thank you. Yes, we will be letting our metadata subgroup know, and that you may be hearing from them. Do you have any questions for those of us on the NISO working group?
Yeah, I can add, speaking of the subgroup, what has been nice about being part of this group is that we have four subgroups at least, I think. And so we're looking to have a good representation. We have publishers, librarians. What are the other subgroups? Help me out. Reporting? Metadata?
Yeah.
Am I missing one?
Are you talking about the subgroups?
Yeah.
Metadata, library, publishers, authors, business processes, and supergroup. Supergroup is just bringing together the library, publisher, and authors groups.
Yeah, so really trying to incorporate the major stakeholder buckets when we're doing this work, and making sure that the output and when it goes out for public comment, it's been equally represented, and really, especially the emphasis with the authors and our institutions. I was also going to add that because we're at Charleston and it's very North America focused, there's also an element of this as far as what OA means in different countries. So we see that a lot at IEEE, where OA in North America is very different than OA in Europe and in Asia, and different audiences, different author perspectives. I noticed up here the lack of interest from authors. So I would love to know more about that, and just understanding, there are some countries where they've fully embraced OA, and there are some that we may have an agreement, but we're really educating from the ground up, both at the librarian level and at the author level. So just looking to standardize that and be able to share clear documentation for those authors and those librarians is really helpful.